Hi, I'm here today with Sarah Wright, who has been a really powerful and tireless advocate for informed consent legislation in her home state of Wisconsin. She is also herself a survivor of non-consensual pelvic exams, and so can really speak to the human impact of this practice. We're really, really grateful that Sarah has taken the time to sit with us and speak with us today, and we're really excited to hear what she has to say, especially since and a big congratulations to Sarah and everyone in Wisconsin. They have become the most recent state to pass an informed consent bill for pelvic examinations. So we offer them a big congratulations, and we're really, really thrilled to see that this work that Sarah started in her home state has finally gotten over the line, and we're very happy for what that means for patients in Wisconsin and students in Wisconsin who do not want to participate in this unethical practice. So with that, I think Sarah can introduce herself better than I can. So Sarah, I will turn it over to you. Please introduce yourself. And if you are comfortable telling us a little bit of your story, what happened to you and the impact that it had on you, we would really be grateful to be able to hear about that.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Livia and at your Cervix for making time for me. I'm really excited to connect with you. And that's part of what's been really exciting is that I independently have had my own struggle that I'll tell you about, but over the years to find out, lo and behold, that there were all of these people around the country who were kind of working in parallel at the same time. It's been really rewarding for me to be able to connect with folks like you and know that it's not just me.
100%.
So my name is Sarah Wright, and I am now a teacher living in Wisconsin. I actually was a recent PhD dropout at the time I
Okay.
had my first surgery and was working at UW
Mhm.
on the campus doing science outreach at the time.
Wow.
So I'm a scientist by training, and I guess an accidental advocate. Um,
Mm,
so what brought me to this issue is that I had a surgery in 2009, and it kind of just came up as a surprise, as I'm sure it does for many
mhm,
people. And I just went in for a routine physical
mhm,
and was sent in to have an ultrasound because the doctor could feel what she thought were cysts of some type on my ovaries. So it
mhm,
turned out that I had two rather large cysts, and
mhm,
I had no symptoms whatsoever. And so I needed to have surgery scheduled. And I think that it's a really important point of view for any medical providers to just imagine from the patient's perspective. You're basically just trying to take care of this problem. Um,
mhm,
you're taking the first available appointment. I mean,
mhm,
most people don't have the luxury or the time. Your
mhm,
insurance tells you go to this clinic, call
mhm,
this number. So it's not as if there's some kind of like deep, long-standing relationship with a
mhm,
surgeon, typically.
mhm,
So I did exactly that. I just called and took the first available appointment. I was getting married in October, and so, kind of was on a timeline. I
mhm,
also worked the academic year, and this was in August.
mhm,
And so, here I was going into surgery with very little, um, you know, preparation or knowledge, or, it wasn't like I had some chronic condition that had been going on for a long time, anything like that. It was just kind of, it came up and had to take care of it. So, unlike most people, though, I'm very lucky to have a sister who is a nurse and at the time was primarily working in a gynecological clinic and
mhm,
assisted in these exact types of surgeries. And so I was able to ask her more about what to expect. Um,
mhm,
and, I am a scientist. I feel pretty privileged and educated and able to advocate for myself. I go looking for information. And even so, it's not as if I was given a lot to go on. So I remember going to my pre-op appointment and, they gave me this pamphlet, and the pamphlet, had a lot of detail on like getting intubated and, that
Mhm.
your abdominal cavity will be filled with CO2 so that they can, navigate. And so I was having a laparoscopic surgery. And so those were the things that I was concerned about and asked my sister about, but at no point in time, like not the surgeon, not anyone on his staff, not in this pamphlet. Even if you go to something like if you do an online search for pelvic
Mhm.
surgery and you end up at a site like Mayo Clinic or
Mhm.
Cleveland Clinic or any of the, typical online sources, like no one will say, oh, as a part of this type of surgery, you should expect that there will be a pelvic exam done um,
Mhm.
by the surgeon. That's not brought up, let
Mhm.
alone by anyone else. And
Mhm.
so I had no idea that my vagina would be involved in any way whatsoever. As far as I knew, there would be incisions in my abdomen, and
Mhm.
they would go through those incisions to get to my ovaries and remove these cysts. So no one at any point in time, anywhere in the process, said that anything would be inserted in my vagina at all.
Mhm.
Um, so what happened was that when I recovered from this surgery, it became pretty clear that I had an injury of some sort, and I ended up going to a women's health clinic to try to figure out what was going on. And so I ended up with a diagnosis of vulvodynia,
Okay.
extreme sensitivity of the vulva.
Which, to clarify, you had not had before.
No,
Uh-huh.
no, not at all. So I remember going to this clinic and she had me, lie back and she asked me to describe what I was feeling. And I was certain that she was, poking me with a toothpick.
Mhm.
And really it was a cotton swab. Not even like a Q-tip, like a
A
piece of
swab.
cotton.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I was just dumbfounded because it felt like this sharp poke.
Mhm.
And so then I was just at least relieved to be able to put a name to it and to have something to do about it. And so I was prescribed some estrogen cream and I was sent to physical therapy, which was really helpful. And so at the time, I kind of treated it as this physical problem that I could solve
Mhm.
and take care of. And I think that I was so kind of just in shock
Mhm.
at the time that, I tried looking for answers. I did get my medical records, which were really sparse. They did at least say there's one line, it says the vagina was prepped properly. So at least it indicated that, you know, they penetrated my vagina, which no one had told me would happen.
Mhm.
Um, and because of my sister happening to work in GYN surgery, she told me that it's common practice for this instrument called a uterine manipulator
Mhm.
to be inserted through the vagina, and it helps to, position the uterus to be able to
Mhm.
most safely access where they're trying to
Okay.
go. So no one told me about this. It's not documented that it was used,
Mhm.
but she said she has never assisted a surgery where it was not used. And so that was my working hypothesis was, okay, this uterine manipulator was inserted through my vagina. It remains in place for the
Mhm.
duration of the surgery. So it made sense that that would be, where this sensitivity would have arisen. And when I got that diagnosis, they said, vulvodynia is very poorly understood, but it typically comes from initially some type of physical trauma.
Mhm.
And so I think this fits the bill. I had no idea anyone would be in contact with my vagina. And then this, instrument is there, in contact with all my nerve endings for hours. Um,
And you also weren't made aware of the potential risk of developing a condition such as vulvodynia if they were to use this instrument. So you didn't have the opportunity to make an informed choice as to whether you wanted to take that risk or not.
no. And so no one brought up anything of the kind. So I
Mhm.
had no awareness, no knowledge, no anything. Um, so That was my working understanding. I even joined an advocacy group of my, insurance provider, thinking
Mhm,
like, oh, vaguely thought, oh, I can help somehow, and it wasn't really the right thing. So I just eventually sort of tried to forget about it and move on with my life more or less. Um, but then in 2018, I needed to have surgery again.
mhm,
And it just so happened. So I knew nothing about non-consensual pelvic exams at the time.
mhm,
Um, the only reason I knew about that was because the bioethicist Phoebe Friesen
mhm,
in 2018. So it was right at the same time that I was trying to figure out, whether this mass on my ovary could be cancerous. I was going through, rounds of getting imaging done and making all these appointments. And I just happened to see her article in Slate. And I
mhm,
thought, well, shit, that probably happened to me too. So I knew about the uterine manipulator because of my
mhm,
sister, but I didn't know about the pelvic exams. And so,
mhm,
again, just to be clear, the surgeon did not tell me that he himself would do a pelvic exam. And
mhm,
I don't dispute that it's useful.
mhm,
Now I understand, okay, the reason for that is because once you're under anesthesia, and your muscles are relaxed, it's the
mhm,
best way to see how the organs are positioned and be able to plan the surgery so it can be done safely. And again, I think patients just want to know. You just want to know what is the purpose of these
mhm,
procedures? What can I expect? And um, it's not so much even about, you know, giving me the right to consent. But even I didn't even know.
mhm,
So I didn't know he needed to do it. I didn't know that the person actually performing the surgery most likely was a resident. I certainly wasn't informed that any other students could have done a pelvic exam as well. Like, who knows how many people did
mhm,
that, right? And so that's really wild to me, that these people who I don't know, who knows, maybe I've sat on the bus with them, maybe I've um, been in line at the coffee shop behind someone
mhm,
who put their fingers through my vagina and we'll never know. I mean, that's just crazy. Um, so once I saw Phoebe's article, that gave me yet another reason to be concerned going into surgery. And I thought, and this is right around the time that the Me Too movement began.
mhm,
And so people were having some different conversations about consent and what it looks like, or should look like. And so I saw my experience very differently as well. And so I actually, probably very naively, I emailed the head of gynecology, of OBGYN at the medical school at University of Wisconsin. And I just kind of figured like, oh, surely we're more enlightened now and, we have updated policies by now, right? So I just wrote and said, I had this negative experience in 2009. I need to have surgery again. I'm wondering what your policies are about educational pelvic exams, as well as this tool called the uterine manipulator. And, I just thought, oh, maybe they just don't know. And so
mhm,
I can help them out. Um, and so to put it mildly, the response was not very friendly.
mhm,
So it was definitely very defensive.
mhm,
Um, and I didn't initially get any response back from the head of OBGYN
mhm.
herself. Everything came filtered from, like
Yeah,
the public relations, or they call it patient relations. Um,
but public
but it's really,
relations.
it's really PR.
Yeah.
Um, So yeah.
In my personal experience, and I'm only speaking for myself, and I'm not naming any particular health system or practice, but I have found that patient relations is very much akin to HR and that they're there to cover the hospital the way HR is there to cover a company. They're not there to look out for the patient. If that happens, great, but if not, their first priority is you know, covering their team. And sadly, the way the system is currently set up, their team, the team of people who are you're trusting your life to, is not the same as your team all the time.
No. Well, and you think about it, I mean, obviously they're getting paid by the hospital.
Yeah.
So are they going to go against the person providing their paycheck? Probably not.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that was definitely disappointing. But it's a little bit fuzzy, the chain of events now, but so I got kind of a generic email back from patient relations. But then I finally had, a pre-op appointment
Mhm.
scheduled. And then I drew up my own informed consent contract that I thought, so I sent this like just a suggestion. Maybe you need a different form that covers the uterine manipulator or pelvic
Mhm.
exams. So I drew up my own little document and I sent it to them. Maybe you should consider using something like this. And so at least, I merited a call from the
That's
head of public relations, not
how
just,
kind.
just anybody. Um, so she called me and basically said, there is no way that your surgeon or anyone else is signing this document. She basically told me to get my surgery somewhere else that would meet my informed consent needs, as if it's just me, like just
Mhm.
my needs, just only I need informed consent.
You're
It's not
being
like,
difficult.
right, I'm being difficult. It's not an actual policy or regulation that is supposed to be followed,
And
actually.
if everybody else is okay with it, then why shouldn't you be? It's interesting, that when they're making this argument, which we hear all the time, just go somewhere else. One of the many things they don't take into account is the fact that they might not hear more opposition because patients are simply scared they will be denied healthcare or be threatened with the
Hmm.
denial of healthcare, as you yourself were. So what they argue is just a few difficult people trying to, or ill-informed activists, as I've been called, trying to make trouble. I would argue that there is a whole different perspective they've not considered at all.
No, not at all. And honestly, it is partly about that power imbalance. And to me, it's also partly in education, there's something called the expert blind spot.
Hmm.
And it's just this notion that when you are the expert in something, it's really easy to forget the point of view of a novice or someone who doesn't have the same knowledge that you have.
Hmm.
And so I think there's so much that's really kind of implicit or, unspoken rules
Hmm.
about how getting healthcare works, or I think just for providers to bear in mind, and I think that there are a lot of doctors and nurses and medical professionals who actually do a very good job of this.
Yeah.
But to keep in mind, okay, this is your everyday, this is your day-to-day life, this is normal for you. But for
Hmm.
the person coming in, this is very likely the first time they've ever had surgery. This is their first time being in the hospital. It's a completely unfamiliar place and process, and all of the things that are very obvious to them about their processes, their policies, their hierarchies, the way things work, what they're expecting, all of that is very implicit. And it's very, very murky to a patient coming in. The patient is just, I have this problem that needs to get taken care of. I need help. I need to be cared for. I'm trying to follow directions and take care of this problem. Um, and just the idea that it's on the patient to try to, decode and navigate and negotiate all these other layers of things. Um,
Mhm.
it's just insane that anybody would think anyone could do that. I really like Ari's analogy about the plumber. You know, you're you're not going to the plumber and having them, take care of something and that the plumber is going to expect you to, know what his process is,
Yeah.
or know what he needs in order to be able to fix what he's going to fix. Like,
Mhm.
no, that would be absurd. Um, but someone who is really good at their job is going to slow down and take the time to explain what's happening and let people know what to expect and make them comfortable.
Mhm.
And I've thought about this a lot that informed consent should feel more like getting a mortgage, which again is something that, people have to be in a privileged position to be able to do. Um, and so if you're lucky enough to get to buy a house, you're probably only going to get to do that a handful of times in your life.
Mhm.
And when you show up, there's all these documents that you have to sign.
Mhm.
And the purpose of the documents is not to protect the bank. The purpose of the documents is not to protect the realtor. The purpose of the documents is to protect the buyer and
Mhm.
inform them of their rights because buyers have been taken advantage of in the past. And so we have federal law that's meant to make sure that buyers know what they're getting into.
Mhm.
And there's a third party person who's there to ensure that that process actually happens and that it happens in a way that the person signing understands as best as we can. And so the document is written in sort of legalese that most people aren't going to really truly understand unless you
Mhm.
happen to be a lawyer.
Mhm.
But the person doesn't just shove the document in your face and walk away. They put the document there and they say, this is what this document is saying. The purpose of this document is, and they'll summarize what's being said in normal language before you sign it. And they also tell you, you have this many days to change your mind. I think that informed consent should be more like that. No one should be shoving a clipboard in your face and walking away. Um, they should be explaining the purpose of the document, which is to protect the patient.
Mhm.
It really bothers me that informed consent has been flipped and perverted, where
Mhm.
the original intent was to protect patients.
Mhm.
Um, it came from the Nuremberg trials, and
Mhm.
it came from preventing something like the Tuskegee study from happening,
Yes.
where yes, a medical provider is doing some procedure to someone, but it's actually not for their benefit, right?
Mhm.
So informed consent was originally meant to prevent abuses from happening, and it was meant to protect patients. But so often it feels like the documents that were made to sign are to protect hospitals. It's more like if you go to the, trampoline place at the mall and you can't go in unless you sign their waiver.
I really like that analogy. I think you really hit the nail on the head.
It feels very coercive. It feels like if you don't sign this, you can't get cared for here. And that is really sick and twisted. That's not what informed consent is supposed to be doing. And so I have a real problem with people being given iPads or pieces of paper with no explanation. I have a big problem with I've gone, to get a mammogram or, it happens all the time where the form says, Dr. So and so explained to me the purpose of this procedure, or explain to me the risks and benefits, or, there's typically some type of language like that. The doctor has explained to me, why I'm doing this.
Mhm.
And so much of the time, that form is given to the patient before they've even met the doctor. And so to me, that is a huge red flag. It makes me really uncomfortable. And part of the consequence for me of having had my autonomy violated is I am on guard anytime I have to go to the doctor. I feel like I'm walking into a battle um,
Mhm.
where I hate feeling like this because most of the time it's not true. But if I'm going to see someone new who I don't already have a relationship with, um, I feel, on guard. I feel this like just tension, and I'm like I'm kind of girding for a fight that I really have to stick up for myself. And that's not how you should be feeling when you're already in a vulnerable position anyway, and you're probably there because you're not feeling well and need help with something. And so it really interferes with the sense of trust that should be there if you're going to entrust someone to take care of you when you're vulnerable and, you know, touch your body, and especially parts of your body that you typically don't let anyone else near.
Mhm.
It's just, I can't even convey how immensely difficult that is for anyone who's been through trauma.
Mhm.
And my trauma was inflicted by doctors because, and the really twisted part is they thought they were helping me. They thought they were doing their job. They think they're good people. And I think that's part of what is kind of this, difficult truth, is that good people do bad things.
Mhm.
And I think that there's this defensiveness because if we're speaking up and saying this wasn't okay, I was harmed by this, um, that gets heard as, oh, how dare you
Mhm.
suggest I did something wrong, right?
Mhm.
And, really, like you can be a good person and make a mistake, but then what that requires you to do is own up to it.
Mhm.
And so, what's actually been the most disheartening to me of all, and what I've struggled with the most, is not even so much that I was harmed, but the response when I tried to get it addressed. So,
Mhm.
being treated as an enemy, the defensiveness of the medical system, um, gaslighting me, treating me like an enemy, that has caused the most lasting damage. It's
Mhm.
made it really difficult for me to just know which side is up. And, if we don't have systems in place to protect people, then what else is there, really? Um, so the most, that's been the hardest part of the process. And to this day, like they won't even acknowledge that what happened happened.
Mhm.
So they'll deny the reality of it. Um, they'll say, oh, well, we had to do this, right? So that argument, like, oh, well, this is just what needs to happen in order for students to learn. And students are saying, no, we don't need this. Don't try
Mhm.
to put it on us. And Phoebe has addressed this really eloquently in her work, that there will be this argument like, oh, well, we're professionals, like it's just a body part to us. So we don't need to treat sexual organs like they're special or treat them any differently from, if I were operating on your eye or something like that. And that's just absurd. It's not about you. It's not about how you feel.
Yes.
I do not want my sexual organs touched without my knowledge. And I wasn't even given an opportunity for consent. I didn't
Mhm.
know that that was going to happen. And I truly believe that um, our unconscious body responds very differently if you know to expect something versus not. It just makes sense, right? So when I did have that surgery in 2018, I did end up, who has the luxury of, changing their plans? I had very carefully planned my surgery to happen just before winter break.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I wasn't going to make a change at that point, so I did end up going through with it as planned, but the surgeon was excellent and, met me where I was and tried to understand what my needs were, which, by the way, I think is very normal. So,
Mhm.
again, not that I was being difficult or that I was asking for anything special. I just, in my pre-op appointment, again, this was the first time I had met the surgeon in person. So, again,
Mhm.
they'll argue like, oh, but the government shouldn't get in the way of a patient-doctor relationship. And I'm like, there is no relationship. I've never met this person. Um, but
Well,
she,
and also, I'm sorry, but you're just making a good point here, and I want to make sure it doesn't get lost. There are people who are very vocal opponents of informed consent legislation who argue that this constitutes the government stepping in between, specifically a woman and her doctor. Um, what would you say to that, apart from the very, well taken point that you've already made, but in a situation where it is a physician that you have a relationship with, it's your long-term gynecologist, what would you say to people who make the argument that the government is stepping in between? Because I've personally, also as a survivor of non-consensual participation in medical education, I view it differently. I view it as the government stepping in to make sure I'm protected when the people, and I'm not saying it's necessarily my physician and none of my physicians, I feel this way about none of them for the record. But sometimes they're trying to do the right thing and they don't know or understand what the administrative staff and administrative decision makers are doing because it has nothing to do with them. So my argument has always been the government is stepping in to correct a problem because you yourselves have proven that you cannot police yourselves. And I guess I'd just be interested to hear what you have to say to that.
yeah, absolutely. Well, so again, this has nothing to do with, government overstepping, anything like that. And it really just comes down to patient autonomy. And I think that often what happens when there is a lack of informed consent is it's not as if there's some like nefarious people, whose goal is to traumatize you and, make it so that, you had this thing happen that you didn't know was going to happen. I think that most of the time, in reality, there's too many cooks. Um,
Mhm,
so I think a lot of times it's unclear who's really ultimately in charge, right?
mhm,
So like you were saying, sometimes, you have these big systems. And so kind of like that problem of like the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. So there's the
mhm,
administrative part, there are the people who are the actual medical providers, and sometimes there's not enough crosstalk or they don't know enough about what the other are doing. You see that happening in like billing and those sorts of things all the time, right? Where the doctor thinks one thing is going to happen and it turns
mhm,
out that that's not really true. Um, so I think usually doctors, they're wanting to try to be advocates on behalf of their patients and they're trying to tell their patients things that are true. Um, I think that sometimes informed consent gets omitted because
mhm,
someone thinks someone else did it. And so I think there's kind of a lack of consistency in procedures. So the hospital that I went to, so by the way, I went to the same hospital twice. So
mhm,
that's really interesting to me, kind of a scientific perspective. Like, okay, I had a very similar surgery in the same facility, the same system. Um, so the only variable really is I had a different surgeon. So I think
Mhm.
that just speaks to the fact I had these two wildly different experiences. And that just goes to show that there's a real lack of consistency and a lack of, is this system working the way that it's supposed to, and whose job is it to really be looking at that? So when I went to my pre-op appointment the second time, one thing
Mm,
that was really helpful is that the surgeon gave me a blank copy of the consent form from the hospital for me to look
mhm.
at. And that I think is really important because number one, then I was having that conversation about consent and about what that form really meant and what it was really saying with the person who is actually going to be performing my surgery. And I think that that is valuable. It was done at a time when I had a chance to really listen and process and understand. Whereas the first time I had the surgery, I was just given these forms. I had fasted for 24 hours. I was super nervous and anxious. I was not in a state of mind to really be taking in and processing information in any kind of meaningful way. So that is not the right time to be trying to have a conversation with a patient. Um,
And it makes you almost wonder why because that's such a simple thing that your second
yes.
surgeon did, but it makes all the difference. Why there isn't consistent transparency like that. I had a situation myself which was nowhere near as significant as your as a surgery, but I was, going for a yearly physical, which for me is actually still relatively difficult because of the medical trauma I experienced in childhood. I had to have blood work done, so I had also been fasting, and I, had carefully planned this so that I could get this physical in, get my prescriptions renewed. I'd taken time off work, and I got there and I was talking to a receptionist, and it's not uncommon in my state. It's certainly not everywhere, but it's not uncommon in Connecticut where they won't even show you the form. They'll just tell you to sign an electronic pad and say, this is what you're signing, which I don't recommend anybody do, and I certainly don't do. I don't sign anything without reading it. So I asked the receptionist for the form, and she was more than willing to give it to me. But for whatever reason, her colleague, the other receptionist, she reacted in a very hostile and defensive way, almost as if me reading that form was a threat. And she was trying to say, well, it's just a financial responsibility form, which when I saw it, I actually saw was not true. It was half that I was taking financial responsibility for the visit if my insurance didn't cover it. The whole other half was consent to treatment,
Mm.
including consent to my information being shared with students for educational purposes, students photographing me or videoing me, which I was conscious I wouldn't have allowed anyway, but it was a blanket consent to my body and information being used for student education in a way that didn't benefit me. So I did make them print out the form and I did read it, and I just simply crossed out the lines that said students could do that because I never anyone who consents to student involvement, I thank you. Because of my personal experience, I'm a hard no every time, and that's my right. So I simply crossed out and initialed the lines, which I've done before at other practices and hospitals, and it's been totally fine. But in this particular instance, the receptionist kind of threw a bit of a fit. She was very angry and upset, and she started going on about how this isn't allowed and I have to talk to my manager. So I just sat down and waited, but the nurse called me back into the exam room before this could get resolved. So I went with her. She, by the way, didn't know what was going on. We're sitting in the exam room. She's taking my health information, taking my vitals, and the receptionist who was so upset or seemed so upset came into the exam room and started yelling at the nurse or speaking to the nurse in a very aggressive way, saying, well, we need to reschedule her appointment because she won't sign this form and she's not allowed to edit it. And the nurse looked scared. So I stepped in and I said, excuse me, can you please, speak to me? And I ended up having to sign the form because, again, I didn't have the luxury of rescheduling this appointment and still getting the medicine I needed, and I've been fasting. um, but I did leave that practice after that, and I left that entire health system after that, which I'm lucky I had the luxury to do. Many people don't. But you and I seem to be very similar in that we've encountered a lot of defensive and outright hostile behavior from people who view us, who are treating us as a threat just because we want to read a form, let alone edit it, read a consent form
Exactly.
that we're signing. I don't understand it. I don't know if you have any particular insight that I'm missing, but I it's so foreign and confusing to me, especially coming from a space where transparency is very valued.
Right. Well, and again, I wonder, did your doctor even know that
He
that
did not.
whole,
I can tell you he did not.
interaction had happened? And so again, um, where's the disconnect, right? And
Mhm.
so this receptionist, caused you to leave their practice, right? And let's be
Mhm.
honest, it's a business in the
Mhm.
United States. So they lost your business
Yeah.
because of that interaction. And so did that person get trained to do that? Was she just acting on her own because
Mhm.
she just perceived that you were being difficult? I hate to say this, but would they treat a man similarly if they asked to read the form? Because underlying all of this, I think, is just, there are those power dynamics.
Yeah.
And I mean, even just, I get the sense even that, female doctors I've seen, I get the sense like they have to kind of prove their toughness.
Mhm.
Um, there's just so many strange, unspoken, implicit hierarchies and, kind of these unspoken rules of how you're supposed to behave and where you fit in. And so, I think there are a lot of places where it's your job as a patient, is to just show up and do what you're told, right? And that any deviation from that, like suddenly now you're a problem.
Mhm.
And that to me is just wild, And so I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I'm sorry to say that I'm not surprised because I've
Yeah.
had very similar experiences for myself, taking my child to appointments.
Mhm.
So I think you and I both, it's like we see everything through this different lens. And it's not because we're being difficult. It's because I think what's so important for anybody to understand is that you don't know what questions to ask when you're going through something for the first time, right?
Mhm.
And so that is why the vast majority of people you're just going to sign what they give you because it wouldn't even occur to you that there's anything wrong with it. Um, People who are arriving in a healthcare setting, a lot of times they're desperate to get help, and they're willing to do anything it takes to get it, right?
Mhm.
And you feel lucky to be there. Maybe you feel lucky that it's being paid for. There are all these ways in which, the person is vulnerable, whether it's finances or you're sick and just so desperate to get help. Um, that and maybe you haven't had an experience where your autonomy's been violated, thankfully. And
Mm,
so it would
thankfully.
never even cross your mind to ask those kinds of questions. Um, so I think that's just so important is that, perspective of the novice. If someone's asking questions, it's because they learned the hard way that they needed to ask that in the first place.
Mhm.
And so it really bothers me when people act as though asking a question is being difficult. Like that's the whole purpose of the process. So again, to me, it's like the waiver at the trampoline place. Like, I'm not going to let you in until you sign this thing. And so, unfortunately, I think informed consent has been rolled in with all these other parts of our current culture where every day you're checking a box to agree to something that has way more text than anybody can possibly read and understand unless that's your field. Um, and that we're asked to do that continuously and that it becomes a habit. And then when people are not just checking the box and they're asking questions, you're really treated as a deviant. Like, what's your deal? Why are you making this so hard? Um, so it really bothers me that, again, informed consent was supposed to protect the patient. And
Mhm.
now it's almost, and I think that even people who work in a medical system, whether it's that receptionist or it's someone else within that setting, I think not even so much providers, but I think anybody in administration, they kind of lump in those types of forms with any other types of legal forms, where most of the time a legal form is meant to protect the institution that wrote it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we all just have this kind of amnesia. This form is different. This form is supposed to protect the patient. It's not supposed to be protecting that clinic. And so that I think is the biggest thing that we have to reclaim. Um, and again, it's just, this idea that somehow we're supposed to just go and, just kind of be grateful and be thankful and like not ask questions. And this idea like, oh, I'm a professional. Like I'm helping you. It's just another body part to me. Um, just it needs to be from the patient's perspective, like I'm not comfortable with this and it's actually your job to be taking care of me, like you're supposed to be helping me. That's the whole point of this. And so we just really have to shift that mentality. And I have thought a lot about, what would really help us get there. And I do think that the educational pelvic exams are different in the sense that um, it involves the student, right? So I
Mhm.
think, like your experience and my experience have shown the issue of consent is much, much bigger.
Mhm.
There are so many other ways that people's consent gets violated. Um, but what's special about the pelvic exam situation is that it's not just the patient that gets harmed, it's the trainee who gets harmed. So they're suffering that moral injury. They're being asked to do something maybe without truly understanding what they're really being asked to do. Um, Maybe doing something that they're uncomfortable with, but they
Mhm.
feel that they have to, or
Mhm.
they're going to get kicked out. Um, so I think that that's what's unique about the pelvic exam issue is that the patients need protection, but so do these students. And
Yeah.
they might not even realize that they need the protection because, again, I think that what happens there is that, I'm trying to imagine from their point of view, you might be like 25 years old, which to me is a kid.
Yeah. It's pretty young,
Um,
like, and in
I
medical
think
school, presumably for the first time, the way a lot of us are having surgery for the first time, they're in a whole new culture and environment too.
exactly, exactly. And again, I think they're also trying to decode all these unspoken rules and understand the hierarchy that they're in and trying to prove themselves. And, I imagine myself as a 25-year-old, and there were a lot of things about the world that I think I didn't fully understand. And so I think that, um, if they're being told to do something, I think that I can imagine that there's a level of trust of, oh,
Mhm.
well, surely this supervisor of mine who maybe I really respect, maybe I really admire, if they're asking me to do something, surely it's for a good reason, right? And I think that they're kind of instilling their trust in the
Mhm.
people training them to be doing what they're supposed to do. And it might
Mhm.
not even cross their mind to be really questioning, well, has this patient really consented? Are you sure? Can I see the forms, right? I'm sure that they'd be treated as if they're being very difficult if they were to ask those sorts of questions. And so I think, I've heard from people who went to medical school at the institution where I had my surgeries done. And, they were basically told, like, oh, yeah, so, you have to at least have like introduced yourself and said good morning
Mhm.
to the person that you're going to practice an exam on. And I'm like, really? Um, so, I've kind of thought about it like, okay, do I need to have seen that person face to face? Do I
Mhm.
need them to have said hello to me? And I actually think no, that's less important to me than just someone being very transparent. You will be under anesthesia. First of all, the person performing your surgery needs to perform a pelvic exam to help ensure your safety. Okay, fine. But you
Mhm.
need to be told that, right? Then there are students here who need to learn how to perform a pelvic exam.
Mhm.
Are you okay with that? And I would want to know, okay, how many people are we talking? Do you mean one student? Do you mean five students? So I think the number makes a difference, frankly. I think maybe different women would have different opinions. So again, people would give you honest answers if you were to ask these types of questions. What kinds of information would people need to know in order to say yes? And to me, it's just be honest, be transparent. I don't even need to have seen the person because, like, what are you really going to say? Oh, hello, person who's going to put their hands through my vagina.
Mhm.
Like, not necessarily, but just
Mhm.
please tell me that that's what's going to happen, right?
Mhm.
I don't need to have coffee with the person. Just I need to know that that's going to be a thing, right?
Mhm.
And I need to also know that it's my right to say no. Um,
Mhm.
and so, like you, Livia, it's really unfortunate. I do feel guilty about it. I'm a teacher. I do really value students having the experience to have, hands-on education and be able to learn. But because of my traumatic experiences, I can't say yes
Yeah.
anymore. I just can't. I have a hard enough time, just the provider themselves doing what they need to do. A lot of the time, I don't have the bandwidth for anybody else. Um, I can barely go get the things done that I'm supposed to. Um, and I hate saying that, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
I just feel like the violation is so deep that there's kind of no coming back from it. Um, and so I think that's really important for people to understand, the whole asking forgiveness versus asking permission. It's like, no,
Mhm.
just ask for the permission. It's a lot better. And it does just feel really icky. And I think about kids that I teach, and I think about, um, who's going to help educate them about consent, and will things be different by the time they get to be my age, and maybe need surgery. And I just think of simple parallels like, um, you know, you're not supposed to slide down the staircase at school, but kids do
Mhm.
it if they
Yeah.
think no one's looking, right? And so that's what feels really gross to me about the educational pelvic exams is this notion like, oh, well, no one will ever know. Like, I think that that's a component here, right? Would anybody dream of, doing an educational pelvic exam on a conscious person without asking them? And I think that actually does happen in birthing situations when people are
It
vulnerable.
does.
It totally.
We've spoken to students who have been instructed to do so. To their credit, those students refused. But it does happen, and I can very easily see a situation in which a student could be instructed to do that during birth and not actually know the person had not consented.
Exactly. And so that goes back to again, what are the expectations? What are the procedures? Who has the patient sign the consent form. When I've had surgery done, it's been the anesthesiologist.
Mhm.
Um, but I've heard that in other systems it's different.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's the nurse, sometimes it's the surgeon themselves. And so, again, I think different facilities can do what works for them, but they need to have a clear and consistent procedure where all parties involved know who's in charge of what and what exactly is being said. Um, you know where to go, like where to refer for information. Let's say that there is a student who wants to verify that the patient gave consent. Like, okay, well, where is that form?
Mhm.
Where can they access it? So it just really comes down to basic transparency, and respect for each other and being on the same page. And I just think, the more we're in a rush and in a hurry and processing people through, um, just trying to get the biggest numbers possible. I'm just afraid that more and more there will be an opportunity for consent to be skipped. Um, and again, not because anyone intends for that to happen, but because it's not prioritized.
Mhm.
And I think that back to, why do we need the government to intervene? And I don't think it's the whole answer, but I think right now it has to be part of the answer because I would like to think that ethics would ensure that informed consent is actually maintained.
Mhm.
But we've seen that unfortunately it's not. And so I think in the absence of ethics and when we can't rely on ethical behavior, that's when we need the law to really kind of ensure the bare minimum. Um, I think for consent to truly be respected the way it needs to be, that it's really about cultural change more than anything else. I think it's about breaking down some of these hierarchies that really don't need to be there. I think it's about um, doctors and patients really trusting each other. I think it's about students being respected and trusted and feeling empowered to use their voice. Because I do think we see that generational shift happening where now that there is greater awareness, there are more students asking questions. So they know what questions to ask. They know that this is a problem. So they're able to be proactive and get information ahead of time instead of finding themselves in this situation that makes them uncomfortable. So I hope that that's the case more and more, that I think from the ground up, from younger people, recognizing that this is not acceptable and kind of demanding change. I think that's a lot of where it has to come from. But meanwhile, we need the law to help us because there really is no recourse when someone's rights have been violated. I found out years and years later that apparently there's a process where you can file a complaint to the
Mhm.
Department of Justice. But there's a statute of limitations on it. I don't think anyone knows that it exists. I think back and not once did anyone suggest that I should file a complaint. Like I went to my primary for a
Mhm.
physical and broke down crying in her office.
Mhm.
And that's how I ended up at the women's health clinic to get my vulvodynia diagnosis. So my primary certainly knew what had happened to me. And she did say, "Oh, that guy, that surgeon, I can't believe he's still practicing." Um, so she recognized the problem, but she didn't help me do anything about it. Somewhere there's a video of me telling my story when I was on my HMO's, patient advisory council or whatever. And I think, oh my God. And then there I am, publicly telling this story, and no one stopped and thought, this is really messed up. This shouldn't have happened. We need to help this person, find some recourse. So just anybody who I would think should have been in the know and should have been aware of policies and helped me, and I probably should have filed a complaint. No one, they probably just didn't even know that that was something they should do. And I really missed out on that opportunity. And then again, I've heard, other women featured in At Your Cervix where I did talk to lawyers, and they basically, nothing illegal happened. They said the best I could do. I was really, beat up coming out of my surgery. One side of me was covered in bruises. I was in so much pain for so many days that it took a while until I even realized my vulvar injury was there. My sister was like, I have never seen someone come out of surgery
Wow.
as black and blue as you were. So she thinks that maybe they should have just, not tried to do it laparoscopically and got in there and, just kind of toughed it out anyway. And really, they probably should have opened me for how big my uh,
Mhm.
cysts were. So, but in any case, I had this horrible recovery. And so this lawyer said, well, you could perhaps go for like an assault charge. But he just said, you know what? I'm so sorry, but they're gonna bring all their resources. Um, they never lose unless someone's like accidentally set on fire on the operating table or something really heinous like that. So he pretty much just said, don't put yourself through something like that. It's going to be really horrible and traumatic, and it's not going to help. And he's probably right. It was
Yeah.
probably the right advice, but that shouldn't be it. That shouldn't be the end. Um, and yeah, just the process of putting the legislation forward, it just really showed me what's what and who's really holding the cards. And the first few times that the bill was up, um, the Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Medical Society, Wisconsin chapter of ACOG, they all registered in opposition to it. No
Mhm.
one bothered to publicly testify. I don't
Mhm.
know why. I don't know what
I have
the reasons
thoughts as
were.
to why, but
Yeah, me too. They can't even bother to show up and publicly state what their opposition is. And to me, that is just disgusting. I go there as this person who was harmed. I am a patient trying to get help.
Yeah.
And I am making myself vulnerable and telling my story. And they can't even bother to show up.
Mhm.
That is just reprehensible to me. And then the fact that behind closed doors, they're able to kill legislation that the public wants. It's just, um, that has been part of the trauma for me is wanting to believe, um, that justice will be served and then seeing when it's not. I just wonder, how do these people live with themselves? How do they look in the mirror? How do they go home to their kids at night, with what they do for a living and still think of themselves as good people? I just really, it makes my stomach turn. Um, so that's been the hardest part. Um, but in a way, the fact that it's been such a long road, um, every time the bill is back up, every time we have a public hearing, every time there's an article in some newspaper or podcast, it keeps the conversation going. And I think that's what we need more than anything is that even if we get laws passed, we can't let this go away. So the more we keep talking about consent and the more people keep thinking about it and keep pushing for change and keep understanding, why we really should be paying attention to this. Like that's what makes a difference. It's that we keep the conversation going. It's never going to stop, really. Um, so yeah, that's where we are, I guess.
It is where we are. And I think that everybody, including me, is curious to hear, the million-dollar question, whether you're going to stay involved in advocacy because your voice is so powerful. But before we kind of go down that road, something that we've touched on indirectly, but I would really love to hear your direct thoughts on is this notion of implied consent, which, much like consent forms, comes initially from a good place. When a person is brought into an emergency room unconscious or incapacitated, they assume implied consent to save their life, which I think is reasonable. And
Mhm.
please do so for me if God forbid that ever happens. But it's become a catch-all. And we've heard a lot more than once from physicians, bioethicists, people who in general are opposed to consent legislation. Well, they're being brought to a teaching hospital, or not they're being brought, they're coming to a teaching hospital. So they should know. And
Mm.
because it's a teaching hospital that they're coming to, and they should know, there's implied consent for students to be involved in their care in whichever way we see fit. I could go on all day about the 5 million holes I see in that argument, but I would really love to hear your response to it.
Yeah, I just think it's ridiculous. Again, that is not what the patient is thinking about. The patient is, oh, okay, I got a referral to call this number and, I'm trying to get this thing taken out or this problem solved. I have this health problem I need fixed. And you're just essentially following directions. Like I went to my primary or I had this imaging done and they told me to call here.
Mhm.
No, no one has any idea. No one is, like, oh, what type of hospital is this? What is their accreditation? How many
Mhm.
employees are there? Who's in charge? What's the, flow chart of
Mhm.
the administration? Like, no. Why would anyone be thinking any of those things? No. If I'm
Mhm.
going to a restaurant, I have no idea most of the time, like who owns this? How is it financed? Um, you know, which one of these servers is in training and how long has that No, you're just going in and you're placing your order and you're, getting done what you need to do. You're hungry and
Mhm.
you are showing up to a clinic because you are sick and you are trying to get healthy. No one is thinking about any of those other things. The notion that someone has any type of awareness, like, oh, this is a teaching hospital. That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. I have no idea how anyone would think that that's a thing that crosses anyone's mind. Even, an educated person who even maybe works at the same university as the medical school that, like for example, the hospital I went to. So, okay, I live in Madison,
Mhm.
where the University of Wisconsin-Madison is located,
Yeah.
which is a gigantic campus of like 50,000 people. So, okay, there is the UW Hospital and Clinics
Mhm.
that is physically located on the UW campus.
Mhm.
And that's where the medical school is housed as well. Okay, but then the hospital that I went to for my surgery is not on campus. It's a mile or so away.
Mhm.
As far as I knew, it had no affiliation with the university at all. I mean,
Mhm.
to some extent, everything around here, we're a university town, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that I somehow would connect the dots, like, oh, that's considered a teaching hospital. Um, there's trainees from the university there. Like, well, yeah, I guess I would imagine there probably are because of just proximity in the
Mhm.
same way that schools will have student teachers from the university
Mhm.
here, right? But this idea that like, oh, you would just know that it's common practice that, trainees are there from the university and that they're being educated. as a matter of your healthcare. Like, absolutely not. I would have had no idea. I think to have that type of expectation of someone is just so ridiculous.
Agreed. I don't think you can say it. I don't think anyone can say it any better than that. And I guess the poor people who are brought in unconscious in ambulances, they should just wake up and know it's a teaching hospital and asked to be taken somewhere else. That's clearly their responsibility. So
Yeah, it's just, it's so silly. And again, and I think it comes back to, is anyone going to begrudge someone, doing a life-saving measure, um, and not having to? No, of course not. And even, what I think caused my injury was this instrument, the uterine manipulator. Um, do I think that that instrument should not be used? No, I don't have a problem with the instrument. I have a problem with the instrument being used without telling me. Um, I realized that I might not be able to give consent to use the instrument because it's really up to the surgeon to determine if they need to use that or not. I
mhm,
completely respect their expertise and I understand that they might have to use that in order to perform the surgery safely. Absolutely. My only problem is that you should not be putting that through my vagina without at least just giving me a heads up. That's all
mhm,
I'm asking for, right? I'm not even asking to be able to give my consent. I just want to know about it and
yeah,
I want it to be documented.
mhm,
I just want my record to say I used this thing. So the second time I had surgery, I told the surgeon, I think that this is what probably caused my injury. And she said, I will try my best to do the surgery without using the uterine manipulator, but I can't promise that
mhm,
once I get in there, I might have to use it.
yeah,
And I said, that's fine. Trust your judgment. And so it turned out she did have to use it.
mhm,
She said my uterus was too heavy. She
mhm,
wouldn't have been able to safely perform the surgery without it. And so, again, even though it was not documented in my first surgery that they used this instrument, how could they not? If my uterus was too heavy to do the surgery without it when I had this little mass on my ovary, there's no way that they could have done the surgery without using it when I had two very large cysts, one on each ovary. I just think there's no way that they didn't use this instrument, but they didn't document it. Um, so it just comes back to, be clear, be consistent, be transparent about what's going to happen. Patients don't expect to be, dictating procedure. That's what the doctor's for. Just like Ari
mhm,
said, I'm not going to tell the plumber how to fix the thing. That's why I call them. He's the expert or she's the expert,
mhm,
right? Like, no, I'm not going to try to tell you how to do it. I just want you to be clear what's happening.
mhm,
I just want you to explain to me what your plan is. That's
mhm.
all I'm asking. And I think that's not too much to ask.
Yeah. For anybody watching who doesn't know, we're referring to Dr. Ari Silver Eisenstadt, who is a physician who himself has been a really powerful advocate for consent legislation and cultural change toward consent since he himself was in medical school. And I would really encourage anybody to have a look at his journal articles, interviews he's given, his testimony. He's great. And the other part of that plumber analogy is him saying, yes, you're the expert, and I called you for your services. Please tell me what you're going to do, and I'm most likely going to let you do it. But the other part of what he said was, but don't think you're going to, he said it nicer, but the other part of what he said was, don't think you're going to come in my house and do whatever you want without asking me. Because it doesn't matter that you're the professional, you're in my house. And I think that that's a really important point. I'm probably going to let you do it because, like you said, the person needs health care and this is how it's going to get done. If they can't safely do the surgery without a uterine manipulator, then they can't. But I need you to tell me ahead of time to expect it and to know that this is a possibility. I'm very familiar with your story. I would again encourage people to read Sarah's testimony and interviews that Sarah has given. But I read in one specific article the hospital where you had your first surgery issuing a statement, something to the effect of, there's no indication that one was used, but even if it was, it's not something we consider risky enough that it would require separate consent, which is so funny to me because it's like, we didn't do it, but even if we did, it's not a big deal. Like,
Right, and there's no specific risk associated with a uterine manipulator, and okay, there's no risk with inserting something through someone's vagina when they're unconscious, and again, it's just, can you just hear yourself for a moment? Because if just go grab 10 people off the street and say, "Hey, how about you're unconscious?" And then this tool gets inserted through the vagina. Does that sound okay? Like, would you assume someone would tell you first? It just, it's absurd to think that, anyone would expect that to not be problematic. So, yeah, again, just there is this kind of arrogance of, well, we're the experts and we know better than you do. And so to insinuate that we're doing anything questionable, you're the bad guy, it's
Mhm.
just it's really ridiculous. And again, it just goes back to, and your experience with the receptionist and when you ask questions, the way that they treated you. And a lot of people in that situation would just shut down, right?
Mhm.
They're not going to speak up for themselves anymore.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think we just, you know, as a culture, need to recognize all of the ways that people get harmed and all of the ways that people feel shut down. And you can imagine why someone would stop seeking healthcare if they keep having experiences like that.
Mhm.
And I think that, we're in a moment right now where, I'm a scientist,
Yeah.
so I hate to say this, but there are some real reasons for hesitancy.
Yeah.
There are real reasons why people um, do not trust medical
Mhm.
professionals and do not trust scientists. And some of that is an educational problem for sure.
Yeah.
But some of it is people have had very real very traumatic experiences and were not heard. And not only were they not heard, but they were treated as enemies. And that can
Mhm.
be extremely damaging.
Mhm. I think that's a really good point, and I think it really points to how this is a public health issue as well, because if people aren't seeking health care and it's solely because they've had a traumatic experience where they've been violated, that puts their health at risk. Enough people do it, it's a critical mass of people whose own health is at risk, and they could possibly unintentionally, and it's absolutely not their fault, and I am not victim blaming, but they could also be unintentionally putting other people's health at risk too. So this is really a concern for everybody. It's a concern for the medical community who and there, by the way, I have had the privilege to know wonderful doctors, nurses, physicians, assistants, and some good administrators too. Um, and those people are very rightly upset by the erosion of trust in them as providers. And I see how it upsets them and I feel badly for them, but at the same time, when I look at some of the things that people are experiencing, I would be lying if I said I didn't get it because I might know you and I know you're great and I'll recommend you to anybody, but a stranger off the street doesn't know which kind you are until they've had an experience with you. And I understand people saying, "Hey, I'm out. I've been hurt enough. I just can't do it anymore. I'm not risking it." And it's a sad state of affairs. And
Sad
that's
state of
why I think, that's why I think that both this legislation and a general cultural shift are not only necessary, but I would just so love, and I'm so encouraged by the students and residents we see now. I would so love to see the medical system involved because I think that would be such a powerful way to demonstrate to their patients that they are trustworthy as an individual provider or they are trustworthy as a health system. I mean, if I saw a health system come out in support of consent legislation, me, all my family, and all my friends would be going there. So
Absolutely. Right.
So
Um,
please go ahead.
oh yeah, I agree with you. Some kind of little icon. I don't know, kind of like if there's the rainbow flag and that's meant to make people feel welcome who feel
Mhm.
marginalized and haven't always been welcomed in a variety of settings. What if there were like a little I respect consent or
Yeah.
I don't
We've
know.
actually thought about rolling out a program like that, but it takes a lot of coordination and while students are very enthusiastic about it, it's getting the old guard on board that can be problematic.
Right. Yeah. And it does just point to a bigger issue as well. I've reflected on myself as a teacher and that, I do have to recognize that I do hold power. And I do have to be very careful
Hmm.
what I say and what I do. And I really try my best. And that doesn't mean that I don't mess up sometimes. And, I'm a human like anybody else and like doctors. But I think the problem is, which we see so often, is the non-apology.
Hmm.
So I think part of the piece is how do we protect informed consent? How do we ensure that that process happens? Um, but I think we also need to talk about what happens if someone is harmed? What
Hmm.
happens if someone's consent is violated? Because right now, that is definitely missing. Um,
Hmm.
and patients are just set adrift. And it's just never really addressed. And there's really no recourse. And we have such a litigious society that I think that's a huge barrier. And part of why hospital administrators are so defensive is they're afraid of being sued or whatever else. Again, they don't publicly testify, so I don't know what their real deal is.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that part of it is just this, just plain old, um, the dynamic of you say to someone, you know, that really hurt me. And then for the other person to not only not apologize, but to say, how dare you say that I hurt you? I am so insulted that you said I hurt you. That somehow pointing out a mistake or a wrongdoing that you're just, like you're the most horrible person or you're the most horrible institution ever in all ways. Like, no. So I think just that kind of like reluctance to just be able to admit when we've done something wrong. Uh,
Hmm.
it's something that I just really think about, like simple things like a kid, um, gets hurt by another kid at school. I think really differently about how I handle that because um, most of the time, people just want to be heard.
Hmm.
Um, they don't want a lawsuit. They don't want, they're not looking for money. Um, they just want to be heard.
Hmm.
Maybe an apology would be nice. Like, please acknowledge that this really happened
Hmm.
and own it and say that you're sorry. Um, that's what people really want, you know?
Hmm.
And then the way that things are structured um, makes it impossible for that to happen. Um, so rather than, I'm sorry this happened to you, let me help you, uh,
Hmm.
you're treated as an enemy. And
Hmm.
that's the real trauma, honestly. And that's what I think needs to change as well.
Agreed. So I guess my final question is something we're all interested in hearing is how are you doing now? And now that the Wisconsin bill has passed, what's next for you? Do you plan to stay in advocacy, or is it something that you would prefer to take distance from for kind of your own well-being?
No, I can't let go
I
of the
didn't think so.
isn't nope. I don't see it as ever done.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm assuming the bill will get signed,
Mhm,
but I kind of, I'm not holding my breath.
mhm,
So we've been working on it since 2019.
mhm,
So I'm certainly not counting anything done.
mhm,
Um, and even if we have that law, it's not the whole equation. It's not going to fix everything. So I think, we've talked about how what we really need is a cultural shift,
mhm,
and that it's not just about pelvic exams.
mhm,
It's so much bigger than that. And like I haven't, sometimes people will ask me like, "Oh, have you connected with other patients or, have other people come to you and said, 'Oh, this happened to me too?'" And I'm like, "No. People don't know that this happened to them. They were unconscious."
mhm.
So
And
by
unless they wake up with an
nature,
injury, or sometimes a student or a resident will actually report it.
right, which
No.
is incredible, right?
Yeah,
And
which
hats
hats
off to
off, like
Ari and anyone else who's really been able to stand up and
mhm,
say when this has happened. That takes incredible courage, and I am so grateful to them. But by and large, patients don't know.
mhm,
They, might have had a sense that something was off or, didn't feel right, but, you just had surgery. So,
mm,
something was wrong to begin with, or, you think, oh, I'm just recovering. Um, so by the very nature of it, which is like kind of insidious, people don't know that this has happened. And I think that's part of how this problem has gone on for so long. Um, but people have told me all kinds of other stories of other ways that their consent has been violated, like your story. So I think, just like the law is going to address non-consensual educational pelvic exams, it's not going to address making sure people know when a uterine manipulator is going
mhm,
to penetrate their vagina when they are unconscious. That still is a thing, right?
mhm,
Um, there are, so many other ways that we probably can't even anticipate that people go to get healthcare and kind of feel like their rights have been skipped over. And again,
mhm,
not through malintent, but often just because of sort of missing a point of view, or something's wrong with the process, or somebody thinks somebody else took care of it. I just think there's so many other instances in which those kinds of things occur. And you have vulnerable people who just, sign anything, do anything, go along with anything because they need help.
yeah.
They feel like that's the price of admission, and it shouldn't feel that way. So, yeah, I'm just getting started. I don't know what'll happen next, but
Well, I feel sorry for anybody who gets in your way. No, I don't. But thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for sharing your time and your story and your perspectives with us. We definitely will hope to keep in touch, and we hope to work with you in whatever capacity possible to, help bring forward that cultural shift. And if further legislation change is needed, that too. But thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you have done and continue to do.
same to you, Livia. I'm so glad that we've connected, and thank you so much for all your support.
Thank you.